Hello, APUSH children, welcome. This is Master Ayatollah General Instructor Chairman Thorson, the benevolent dictator, coming to you live from Bunker 167. This is Chapter 27, the Cold War. Let's get started. The Cold War itself was a fight between the USSR and the United States from 1945 to 1991, and they were fighting over who could rule the world, basically. And why did it even start? It actually started before 1945. They were arguing with each other during the time of World War II over how the world should be run after the war actually ended. The U.S. is like, listen, let's have like this big international body where everybody gets along. No, none of these military alliances that we've been seeing with the last two world wars. And the Soviet Union's like, no, I want to control these areas. And then during the war, when they were meeting in Tehran, they could not make a decision based off of what to do with Poland, so they were fighting over that. And the USSR was really ticked off at the United States and the United Kingdom because they wanted them to open a front in France to fight the war to help relieve some of the pressure from the Soviet Union, and they just refused to do so. So the tensions were before that. When they met at Yalta, an area that was in the Soviet Union at the time, during World War II, they had to meet about basically what to do after the war again. They had to figure out really what to do. And they got into some fights again. It was the big three there. That's Churchill from the UK, FDR from the US, and then Stalin from the USSR. At the time, this is where they created the idea of the United Nations, where we have a General Assembly and the Security Council with permanent members. The Security Council, which still exists today, has 5 permanent members. It's the US, or Russia now, Great Britain, France, and China, and they basically have veto powers over everything. It's almost like you would see them as like the executive branch of the UN. But they did set up that, which is great, but then they had huge disagreements over what to do with Poland. They still couldn't figure out what to do, and they were having disagreements over what to do with Germany. Poland thing, completely unresolved. The German thing, they said, okay, if we can't make a decision on what to do, let's just divide it into 4 zones. The U.S. will control one, Great Britain, France, and then the USSR. Those will be the 4 countries controlling the 4 zones of Germany after the war. In April of 1945, FDR died of a stroke. Harry S. Truman becomes president. First order of business, he's like, I'm going over to Europe. I'm going to put Stalin in his place. I don't trust the guy. He's bad news. I'm going to take care of this. So they have a conference at Potsdam. He goes, listen, Stalin, you do what you said in the Yalta conference. You better do it or you're going to be in big trouble. Well, it didn't really go over very well. And he's like, sounds like, well, I have these new borders for Germany and Poland. And Truman's like, oh, okay, I guess. But I'm not letting you make reparations in Germany. You can't make them pay back what they did to you. Well, I guess you can do it in your zone, but we're not doing it in our zones. And then sounds like, whatever you want. Oh, and by the way, Poland's now communist, and you can't do anything about it. And Truman's like, all right, I guess. So really, Truman didn't get much done at this conference. Now that the Cold War is in full force, we're trying to figure out what to do and how we can get involved in the world. The United States felt that they had this like open world policy, but they would still police the rest of the world. So even though they're like, let's all get along, but in reality, they're like, but if you do anything wrong, we're kind of gonna get involved. Now, this is where it got really messy because at the time in China, they're having a civil war between the nationalists who were run by Chiang Kai-shek. This is a guy that the United States reluctantly had to support because he was battling the communists led by Mao Zedong, who the government really didn't want to support. Well, guess what? Mao Zedong won, and the communists took over China, and they're like, oh no, this is terrible. It's another country falling to communism. It's the biggest country in the world. What are we going to do? I know, let's focus on Japan. We got to get in that region somehow. Let's just lift them back up and make them pro-American. So that's how they got their foot in the door in Asia at the time. So instead of this open door policy anymore, we're like, okay, we got to figure out something else. How about we use the policy instead of containment? We want to stop communism from spreading like a disease and contain it in certain areas so it doesn't go to other countries. So the first thing they did was the Truman Doctrine. That's where Truman decided to give money to countries that are on the precipice of falling to communism. That was Turkey and Greece. So like I told you in class, Truman likes greasy turkey, and that's how you can remember this. He gave $400 million to these countries. All is well. They support us. They're democratic. Great. George Marshall, the Secretary of State in 1947, is like, listen, if that worked for Greece and Turkey, why don't we do it for all of Europe? Even the Soviet states and the satellite states, let's help them too. We'll give them money. This way we can have, help them out because they were devastated by war, but we can also rebuild their markets so that they'll buy and sell our products, and it'll make sure that we are containing communism. Now, the satellite states and the Soviet Union, those eastern the satellite states, again, being the Eastern European countries that supported the Soviet Union, they refused to take the money. But the Western countries in Europe, they took the money and they rebuilt their economies, and they were able to work with the U.S., so it helped us too. We were also preparing for the Cold War at home. We weren't just necessarily worrying about what's outside of the U.S., but doing stuff within the U.S. For instance, we kept military wartime levels at where they were during World War II. But instead of focusing on the war, we focused more on the development of nuclear energy. We also created the National Security Act of 1947. Instead of the Department of War anymore and the Secretary of War, we now have the Department of Defense and the Secretary of Defense that control all of the military operations. We have a National Security Council in the White House that deals with our national security. And this is the creation of the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. We used to be the Office of Strategic Services. The OSS is now gone. Now we have the CIA, which still exists today. They collect information and intelligence from other countries to make sure we're safe. Next, we're going to talk about NATO. Now, before I actually get into why NATO was created, we need to look at why we really ticked off Stalin and actually some of our peace was collapsing. Truman and the France, and along with the United Kingdom, they decided to get together and merge the 3 zones they controlled in Germany into one country, Western Germany, or the Federal Republic. Now, that really ticked off Stalin. He got so mad that he just made a blockade to get any aid into Western Berlin, since West Berlin was within the USSR's German borders. And Truman did the Berlin airlift, where he would fly in any type of supplies, drop it, and then go out. Well, Stalin got really ticked off about that too. Eventually the blockade died out, but he was still upset. So we realized we needed to strengthen our military position because we were really ticking off the Soviets just in case something bad happened. So the United States and Western Europe together in 1949 created the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Still exists today. They meant to protect all of its members. If there's attack against one, there's attack against anybody, every one of the members, and they would work together to fight off communists. Well, the communists got ticked off and they formed their own NATO, and they called it the Warsaw Pact. It's gone now, though. Now, in 1949, there was a lot of stuff going on where we really needed to reevaluate how we were going to take care of communism. We saw the Soviets creating a nuclear program. We saw China falling to communism. So the National Security Council created NSC 68, where they said, you know what? We have to oppose any communist expansion anywhere in the world, and if we have to use our military to do so, so be it. So instead of throwing money at the problem like we had with the Truman Plan, or Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan, now we're going to try to take military action. The next section we're going to focus on is the American politics and what America was like after the war. Usually after war, whenever all the war supplies and everything stops being produced, we usually see some type of recession or depression because all the effort and money and economy we were going towards, it's gone and we don't need it anymore. But luckily, good things happened because so much money was being saved during the war, because people were just, during a war, people are very conservative. They don't want a lot of change, so they keep pretty stable. They aren't spending any money. There's not really much to spend money on because all the stuff being produced was for the war. But once the war was over, they actually started spending some money. So there's money going around. The GI Bill gave returning soldiers education and training and jobs. And that helped increase spending as well. But there were some problems too. We see high inflation. Prices are starting to go up. There's unrest in the labor world. We see unions striking not only in the mining areas but in railroads. And a lot of the women and minorities that had jobs during the war, because all the white men were off fighting, they lost their jobs to the white men when they got back. Truman also tried to push forward his plan of the Fair Deal, which was a domestic program to provide several things to the country, including raising the minimum wage to about 65 cents, creating the Fair Employment Practices Act, expanding Social Security, and even creating a national health care system. However, the House and the Senate during this time period, around 1946, was controlled by Republicans, and with Truman being a Democrat, they didn't like what he did, so they rejected all his plans. So instead, they tried to push their own plans, which would be to reduce government spending, increase tax cuts for the wealthy, not raising minimum wage. And Republicans also went after the unions. They wanted to decrease the power of the unions that they got with the 35 Wagner Act. So they created in 47 the Taft-Hartley Act. Now this Taft-Hartley Act basically said that it's illegal for unions to force membership upon people, which is the closed shop idea. And they also basically limited efforts of strikes and allowing the unions to organize. When the 1948 election came around, it pretty much looked like Truman did not have a chance of winning that presidential election. There are two sides of the Democrats that were against him. There were the Dixiecrats, the Southern Democrats. They didn't like him because Truman was pushing for civil rights legislation, and they were like, no, we don't want that, because, you know, they were racist in the South, unfortunately. And then even the progressives, they're like, we're not going to support this guy either. He had very little support by the Democrats. And the Republicans had a great candidate. They had Thomas Dewey, who basically, it seemed like he was going to win. He had full support. And Truman's like, you know what? I'm going to take care of this. So he goes around the country, campaigns like crazy, makes over 300 speeches all over the country. He's like, listen, I'm going to help the common man. I'm going to reduce inflation. And he won with that. The people supported him. He won very narrowly, but he still won. And somehow the Democrats won the House and the Senate. So they were able to start getting the fair deal put back into place. Now, there were things that they were for and were against. So they did allow for the new minimum wage increase and Social Security to expand, housing to expand. But the Democrats in the House and the Senate, they really refused to pass anything dealing with national health care, education, or civil rights. So even though Truman really did, he was the first president of the century to really push for civil rights, he didn't end hiring discrimination in the workforce, in the government specifically, but he was the first president, and he was the president, to desegregate the armed forces. So there's a good little bit of civil rights that was happening during this time. If you look at this picture above, you can see this is one of the most famous pictures in American history. Truman laughing while he's holding up the Chicago Tribune paper that says that Dewey defeated Truman. They printed this prematurely when Dewey looked like he was going to win the entire election, but Truman actually won the whole thing. This is also the time we're seeing the nuclear age begin. Now, nuclear weapons and nuclear power being created at this time, it was seen as good and bad. Nuclear weapons were viewed with fear because of the threat of the Soviet Union, and it was made through different pop culture, film noir, which is just basically like that dark, lonely type of film, if you've ever seen movies like that, and the government preparations for nuclear attacks. So they are showing people there might be a nuclear attack, and it was really freaking people out, like you've ever seen maybe with the duck and cover, where kids were encouraged that if there was ever a nuclear attack to duck and cover, duck under their desk and take cover. Like that, you know, would help from a nuclear explosion. But the public was also in awe of it. They're like, this is awesome. It's cheap power. If it's used right, it's clean, it's unlimited, and it's something we've never done before. It's amazing to see how far technology can go. Next, we're moving on to the Korean War, which started in 1950. But what happened in the first place? During World War II, the USSR had control of the north part of Korea, while the United States took control of the southern part. Neither one of them was willing to give it up. Well, after a while, they kind of decided to leave. They're like, I'm just out of here. So North Korea stayed communist, while South Korea was ruled by the capitalist Syngman Rhee, who was a supporter of the United States. Well, the nationalists, the communists in the north, decided to attack the south in 1950 because they wanted to reunite all of Korea under one communist regime. Well, the U.S. is like, oh, we can't let this happen, containment, we got to keep this from spreading. So they go to the UN and they're like, listen, can we send support and help over there to help these guys out? So they sent troops over to help out the South Korean army, and they wanted to contain communism but also liberate those in the country. Now, why didn't the USSR stop this? Because the USSR was ticked off at the UN at the time, so they weren't even there to veto it. Sometimes it's easier to understand things if you can actually see it in picture form, so I just wanted to show you this map really quick. This is a map of Korea. You can see that north is ruled by Pyongyang. That is a communist country. All the countries in red are communist. The south, its capital city was Seoul, and the line between them is the 30th parallel that divides them. The war was pretty much a stalemate. We were able to push up into the northern territory with MacArthur ruling the UN forces, but then China, just on the northern border of North Korea, was like, you know what, we need to step in because we don't want the U.S. attacking us. So they push in. They're able to push the forces back down, the UN forces and the South Korean forces back down. So they pretty much were going back and forth on the borderline. It was a stalemate. And this happened all the way through 1953. Now MacArthur's like, if we want to win this thing and push these guys out, we need to attack China. And Truman's like, we're not doing it. I refuse. I'm not getting into another world war. So MacArthur went on TV. He's like, look at this guy. Why isn't he following us? Why isn't he following my belief? We should do this. And Truman fired him for it in 1951. Now at home, there was limited mobilization. Truman was trying to help out, but then some things got worse. He ended up having to seize railroads and steel mills because of union problems and trying to increase government spending during this time. But people were still afraid because all of a sudden we're in stalemate in this small war and we can't move anywhere. So we're like, this is what it's going to be like fighting communism in just a small area. What's it going to be like on the big scale? So people were getting a little freaked out. With people being afraid, the Republicans in Congress started to take advantage of this fear. They used this to promote basically what's known as the Second Red Scare, the first one being in the 1920s. They wanted to promote and prompt fear of Stalin and communism growing and being subversive into our culture, meaning like the communists are being infiltrated into our government to steal secrets from our government and give them back to the Soviet Union, so eventually our whole country could become communist. Now, they did this with the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, in 1947. They were trying to investigate it. They used the fear because they basically told American citizens, listen, we've got this. We'll take care of any communists. And American citizens were like, okay, thank you, Republicans, for doing this for us. And they went after someone in the State Department known as Alger Hiss. And when they found some stuff that he was being compliant with the communists a while back, but he still was, people started being very afraid that communists were infiltrating our government. Now, I know when you think of domestic subversion, who's involved in all this, you would think of Joseph McCarthy. But who's the one that started it all? The leader of HUAC, the leader of the House Un-American Activities Committee, Richard Nixon. At the time, he was a freshman congressman, and then eventually he's going to move on into politics, as you guys probably know. Many other things were done to calm down the fears of the United States citizens during this time of communists. In 1947, President Truman created the Federal Loyalty Program, where he wanted to go around and see which type of federal employees were loyal to the country and not communists. We also see the FBI monitoring any type of radicals. They even passed the McCarran Internal Security Act, which would make it where all communists would have to register that they were a communist, so that the government could keep a better eye on them. Another incident that happened that really played with the fears of Americans was when the Americans found out that Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were selling Manhattan Project secrets of creating the atomic bomb to the Soviets. While they were used as scapegoats, yes, they were guilty, but they were executed for their crimes, something we really don't see anymore today. The man that really was in charge of the whole domestic subversion thing was Joseph McCarthy. He was a senator from Wisconsin. He began leveling charges against State Department workers and other agencies, State Department being the department that works with foreign countries. And they were the ones at the forefront of this anti-communist hysteria and partisan politics. But eventually he discredited himself and it kind of died down. The Republicans started to revive themselves, though, because of the Korean stalemate and because of anti-communist sentiments. People were very disappointed in Democrats, but they still tried to push forward a candidate. In 1952, in that presidential election, Truman did not run again, so the Democrats chose an Illinois governor, Adlai Stevenson, to run for president. Now, he was viewed as very liberal. He was also viewed as weak at communism, whereas the Republicans chose Dwight Eisenhower, who's a war hero, and Nixon to be his vice president. Now, Eisenhower said we got to end this war in Korea, so people were happy with that, while Nixon said that we're going to go after the communists. So Eisenhower and Nixon won by a huge margin, and the Republicans in 1952 took control of both houses of Congress. And because of this election, and because of the election of Ike, or Eisenhower, Ike is his nickname, it's going to lead to the era in the 50s known as the Affluent Society, which is part of Chapter 27. So that's it for, part of Chapter 28. So that is it for Chapter 27 now. Thorson, Forge.